I beat him to the ground. What I remember most were his eyes, burning with rage. But in the end, I was standing, and he wasn't. Just like so many others, before he ever raised a fist, he had spewed vitriol and threats at me. By that point in time, my car tires had been slashed again and again. Hate and obscenity keyed into the paint of my car. Over the years in my hometown, friends and strangers alike tried to beat the kippah off my head. And my scars still tell the tales of those years. Seeing him on the ground sparked an inner debate of justice. He started the fight, but I didn't walk away. He deserves seeing what hate reaped in this world. But the lingering truth swept across all other thoughts. A part of me, a large part of me, had wanted this all along. And then in an instant, everything changed. Tears fell into sobs, and he called out, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't want to be this." And he reached out his hand, a plea, an offering, an act of vulnerability. I still marvel at how the lines of rage melted into streams of tears, how a clenched fist became an open handshake. And in his transformation, I moved from triumph to shame. I had hurt him badly, out of pride, out of anger, out of believing that hate was something to be obliterated rather than extinguished. In the end, I took his hand. We went our separate ways. I never saw him again. But his tear-streaked face, his open hand, that vulnerability he showed, lingers today. He started it, but he also ended it. Not with hate, but with an outstretched hand. And it's that hand that still holds the source of so much of my struggle and my hope. The Talmud recounts a tale of Rabbi Eliezer, a poor man who one day fell ill. Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him and found him lying alone in the dark weeping. "Why are you crying?" he asked the sick man. Eliezer answered, "I'm weeping because all of the beauty of this world will one day disappear." Yochanan replied, "Then you have good reason to weep." And the two of them sat and wept together. Yochanan said to Eliezer, "Give me your hand." And so he gave him his hand and raised him up. Once Yochanan himself fell ill and was visited by a friend. After speaking with him, the friend held out his hand and raised Yochanan up. A question is later asked, why, if Rabbi Yochanan was strong enough to lift up another, why couldn't he raise himself up now? The rabbis answered, because the prisoner cannot free himself from prison. A prisoner cannot free himself from prison. Sometimes the healer becomes the one in need of healing. Sometimes the helper becomes the helped. Self-sufficiency is a cruel illusion. Sooner or later, we all learn the truth. I need someone else's hand to lift me up, and someone else needs me. Vulnerable are we all. At one point or another, every single one of us in this room will have the myth of self-sufficiency shattered. The 43-year-old spouse diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, the teen suffering depression, the unexpected firing from a 20-year career. And we see suddenly that no amount of money, no political connection, no personal record at the gym will remove our vulnerability. Our veil of delusion that we can armor ourselves against the storms, protect ourselves and our loved ones from the most crushing existential uncertainty, in but an instant, the veil of delusion is ripped away, and we are left naked and exposed, like Job before the whirlwind, vulnerable and frightened. Most of us, we run for cover. We desperately try to return that veil to our eyes, to push away the uncertainty. And so we come to confuse feeling with failing, and emotions with liability, and vulnerability with weakness. So we imprison ourselves in the myth that we can hide behind concrete and confidence. We shape stories that explain away the cancer or the job loss or the marriage that fell apart. We blame ourselves for our misfortunes. We meet cruelty with rage, and we place armor over our vulnerability. But in doing so, we imprison ourselves in a broken myth. Over the past decade, the research and writing of Dr. Brené Brown on shame and guilt has reached all corners of the globe. Her TED Talk on vulnerability has been watched by more than 40 million people, and her lectures, courses, and books have helped reshape companies, national policies, and millions of lives. For those of you who have not been following her over the past decade, here's the summary of all her research in one sentence. The human experience of vulnerability is both the thing we fear most and is always the foundation of our best lives. In Dr. Brené Brown's words, our rejection of vulnerability often stems from our associating it with dark emotions like fear, shame, grief, sadness, and disappointment. Emotions that we don't want to discuss even when they profoundly affect the way we live, love, work, and even lead. What most of us fail to understand is that vulnerability is also the cradle of the emotions and experiences that we crave most. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, of belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. This is our season of vulnerability. These days of awe, we throw ourselves forcibly into the existential waters of uncertainty. As we just read, who by fire and who by water. We define ourselves for these days within these walls, not by our stock portfolios or our awards, but by our failings, by our feelings, our faith. The rest of our days we may walk around believing the world owes us, but today we, each of us, place ourselves in a position of seeking forgiveness. And surely this position, facing and owning the harm that we have caused, the responsibility we claim, is the ultimate vulnerability. And we sit in it together. Vulnerable together. Vulnerable together. This is the essence of this season, and indeed the entire Jewish worldview. Perhaps best captured in this famous rabbinic parable regarding the mindset of one who intentionally errs and missteps in the world. This is to be compared to people who were in a boat, and one of them took out a drill and began to drill a hole beneath his seat. His companion said to him, "Why are you doing this?" He replied, "Why do you care? I'm not drilling under your seat, I'm only drilling under my own." They replied, "But don't you see, you will flood the boat for us all." The purpose of this season, the ultimate Jewish lens, is the collective perspective. It is one that shatters the myth of self-sufficiency that we are solitary islands of existence. Our future, whatever it might be, is one in which we will either rise or sink together. In our liturgy, we don the collective voice. In our confessionals today, we take on the sins of the world together. We are minute by minute, prayer by prayer, trying to hone a consciousness that recognizes that whatever happens to you ultimately matters to me. And so it is that we are, all of us, vulnerable. We may feel this in the widest pulls and forces, rising tides and temperatures, uncertain global markets, the threats of nationalism and bigotry. And we may feel this in the most personal of ways. As families divide along political lines, tribalism transforms the workplace and civic life, and fear hammers our next generation in active shooter drills. We can lock all our doors, we can put our money into mattresses, pile sandbags in front of our buildings, and we can build the highest of walls. But none of it saves us from the truth. We will rise or sink together. And try as we might, in this global game, there is no way to vote someone off the island. I started walking away from fights after that outstretched hand. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Around that time, a number of wealthy Jewish families had started buying up struggling businesses. Then the synagogue was shot at, holes peppering the glass and stone of the temple. Protests decrying the shooting were organized, and people of the city armored themselves in rage. Later that year, we had a forest fire just outside the city. Entire hills were consumed by the blaze. I remember how bleak and blackened the hills looked. But within weeks, the undergrowth came back. And within months, new Douglas fir trees were beginning to sprout. Because, of course, the heat of the fire opened enough of the pine cones for the seeds to replant the hills. And out of that fire, God called. Our sages taught that at the burning bush, it had been aflame since the beginning of time. Moses was simply the first to take notice. He was simply the first to hear the voice that had been calling out at every moment of every day. Abraham, a knife in hand, ready to strike down his own son, hears the divine voice and sees another path forward. Hagar, suffering and starving, cries out in despair in the desert, and God opens her eyes to see the redemption right before her. It is in the wilderness, in the places of vulnerability when we are exposed, that God calls out to us. All around us are reminders of change, of other ways forward. We find God's voice in nature, in the crumbling of mountains, in the blossom of spring. We find God's voice in relationship, in the evolution of psyche, and the fall and rise of love. We find God's voice in the face of another in rage, but also in tears. God calls out that change is all around us. And if the world can change, if others can change, then so can we. These are more than interesting times. These are terrifying times. As one who bears the scars of anti-Semitism, and a people who has faced this plague in every place in every generation, it isn't the existence of such hate that shocks and awes today. It's its 21st century bloom and the modern mutation of it. 89% of European Jews believe anti-Semitism is on the rise and now fear for their own safety. In 2018, France reported a 70% increase in anti-Semitic hate crime just over the previous year. In that same time span, it nearly doubled in Germany. And just this week, including today, we see anti-Semitism is abloom there as well. Here in the United States, the number of violent and nonviolent acts of anti-Semitism has reached near historic heights and continues to rise, with assaults against Jews doubling since 2017 alone. This year, with Jewish blood running in the pews of the Tree of Life Synagogue, we saw two truths ring loudly in the air. First, we saw that as an American Jewish community, we are vulnerable. And as we have seen in so many other eras, privilege and acceptance in so many industries has not extinguished the fires of hate. And second, when hate rises in one place against one people, it grows everywhere and against everyone. We see nearly identical statistics towards Christians, Muslims, people of color, queer communities, and on and on and on. The question that remains is, how will we respond? First, of course, comes safety. We are blessed by the leadership of congregants and professionals who made safety and security a foundation of our synagogue and our schools. We should pour forth gratitude to our former Director of Security, Tom Perry, and our current Director of Security, Ellen Chang, for their leadership and their incredible teams, and the officers of the NYPD who daily work to make these walls a haven against the storms of hate. Second, we are obligated to leave our intellectual shelters of security and become informed, no matter how frightened it makes us, to make ourselves vulnerable enough to bear witness to the trends and tides of our times, to pick up history books, to listen to survivors, to approach the articles on anti-Semitism today. In doing so, and acknowledging the vulnerability of this place and time, we force ourselves to see our own well-being is tied to that of others, and we raise a sense of responsibility to address the holes of hate that threaten to sink us all. In just a few weeks, we will mark this first anniversary of the Tree of Life murders with a panel on anti-Semitism, helping to inform us and move us to turn grief and fear into action and change. And third, we are responsible to be agents of such change with our Jewish collective perspective. Sadly, as we have already seen in history, attempts to directly destroy hate only stokes the fires of enmity. Fists and vitriol do not address the underlying scourge. Anti-Semitism and bigotry of all kinds is predicated on the belief that it is possible to cast others off our existential ship. That if we can remove the people we deem to be cancerous citizens, we will be freed from their taint. But surely we, who have been so often labeled as such a cancer, can see the absurdity of that approach. And so obliterating or excising anti-Semites will always ultimately fail. But a small town in Bavaria might inspire a different approach, a new approach. In Wunsiedel, Bavaria, citizens noticed an increase in neo-Nazi rhetoric. And so when protests and legal complaints failed to deter an annual neo-Nazi march, the town tried a new way. In 2013, residents flocked to the march, offering refreshments and using hilarious signage to publicize their plan. For each meter the neo-Nazis marched in their town, local residents and businesses would donate €10 to a charity that helps people escape extremist groups through education and support. In this setup, the residents of the city forced a collective perspective. Neo-Nazis' choice to march. They also supported the very mechanism designed to eradicate such hate: education and exposure. Within a single year, the march disappeared. And this approach is now being replicated in other towns in Germany, Sweden, and around the world. We at Road of Shalom want to be a part of this movement to elevate a collective perspective, to take the essence of these days of awe and move them into the many spaces in which we all occupy. This past February, Marnie Feinberg, daughter-in-law of Joyce Feinberg, who was murdered in the Tree of Life synagogue, she started a new campaign. She sought to combat anti-Semitism in perhaps the most Jewish way possible, through food. Noting that the majority of hate crimes are perpetrated by people who have little to no understanding or exposure of the people they have attacked, Marty wanted to address the ignorance and delusions that underpin hate. So she started an initiative called Two for Seder, urging every Jewish household to invite two people in their orbit who have little understanding or experience of Jews and Judaism to attend their Passover Seder. Last spring, 1,000 Seder tables around the world, from here on the Upper West Side all the way to the base camp at Mount Everest, used Marnie's initiative and our collective narrative of redemption to expose, to educate, and to build explicit relationships. For so many of us, our Jewishness may be hidden in the landscape of our daily lives. So many of our colleagues, our friends, our associates may not realize how close to home anti-Semitism really hits. In breaking matzah together, we elevate an awareness that we are woven together. In offering the outstretched hand, we can sit together in the stories of strangers and emerge with connection. This year, we will be encouraging our entire Rosh Shalom community to be a part of the Two for Seder movement, and not only bring our Jewish out into the world to be seen, but also bring that larger world back into our homes. A student once asked her rabbi, "Why does the Torah tell us to place these words of Torah upon your hearts? Why does it not tell us to place these sacred words into our hearts?" The rabbi thought for a moment and answered, "It's because as we are, our hearts are closed, armored up, and we cannot place the holy words directly into our hearts. So we place them on top of our hearts. And there they stay until one day the heart breaks and the words fall in." Vulnerable. This is not our weakness, but rather our source of strength. Here we sit, invited into the place we so often avoid. Here we face our missteps, our crushing defeats, the fears that keep us awake, the shame that shadows our days. But we sit together. We call for betterment together. We lift our voices in hope together. Together. That is our worldview. That is our perspective. Vulnerable, we may acknowledge our own humble need for others. Vulnerable, we may recognize the need others may have for us. Vulnerable, we may recognize that connection is growth through shared tears and laughter and outstretched hands. Vulnerable, we see the myth of self-sufficiency and see that we are not alone in this world. Vulnerable, we see that our only path forward is together, whether we like it or not. We carry the burnt hills and the fading scars. We see the reapings of hate just as we feel the inadequacy of its denial. But God calls out of the depths from the ash-covered seeds and the outstretched hand. The prisoner cannot free himself from prison, but we can free each other. The love of rain against parched earth, the open hand lifting out of loneliness. Vulnerable is the only way we come together. In our fear, may we offer an open hand. In our failings, may we muster the courage to lift our eyes to gaze beyond ourselves. And in our struggle, may we embrace the possibility of another way forward. There was once a young man who alone tried to beat away his fears. But eventually the armor cracked and the heart broke open. And the words finally fell in. Our future is together. Shana Tova.